So tell me, what does a note mean? Yet put 30,000 of them together, and it may make a piece of music that is capable of changing your life forever. It's the context that makes it what it is.
Dr. Iain McGilchrist will be giving a series of 3 lectures here at Ralston College in Savannah.
Time is not a succession of moments. It's a continuum. Everything flows. It is my hope that people may find in these lectures something that is both beautiful, good, and true.
He's a man who understands why education is necessary and what a university is at its best.
Each existing being is like a whirlpool in a stream. They are the river, they are the sea for the time that the water is there. Though we appear to be divided, we are in fact unified.
His visit here is, for me, a landmark of what this college aims to become. Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Blackwood, and I'm the president of Ralston College, a new university in Savannah, Georgia. I have the enormous pleasure to be here with Dr. Iain McGilchrist today. Dr. McGilchrist has been here at Ralston College to give our Sophia Lectures. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about what those lectures are and to give you something of an introduction so that you can perhaps more fully appreciate them online. What an enormous privilege it has been for us to have Dr. McGilchrist here. He is a psychiatrist, a philosopher, theologian, a man who very impressively and beautifully brings together both the arts and the sciences. He is a humanist in the truest and best sense of that word. The Sophia Lectures are meant to be a moment of deep and rich thinking in the midst of the soundbite and hyper-politicized rapid cycles and very often mistaken takes of our media, of our so-called public intellectual class. And what we wanted to do with these Sophia Lectures was to bring in, as we did last year, one of the brightest and boldest thinkers of our time who can go deep into the ultimate questions of human life and to help us understand in the madness and churn and change of contemporary life that's transcendent and fundamental human longings unchanged, and to situate our moment of contemporary culture within the long arc of perennial human questions and the fundamental truths and orientation of human life. With that said, Iain, it is such a pleasure to have you here.
It's a great honor and delight to me to be here. Thank you.
First, why are you here? Why were you willing, with all of the many invitations you have, far too many I know than you can possibly accept, to come to Savannah to deliver this series of 3 lectures?
Where to start? There were so many things that attracted me. I have an association with Ralston College. You have made me part of the structure of the college in as much as I'm a visitor with a capital V. But I wanted to visit with a small v. And I'd never been to Savannah. I believe profoundly in what Ralston College stands for. I think it's so important that there are colleges that are willing to, as you say, buck the trend towards a simplification and superficial rendering of what is meant by scholarship and an understanding of our culture and of the history of our culture. And I'm very delighted to find that it lives up very much to my expectations. I've met so many lovely young people here. Excited, interesting, open-minded, charming and funny. And I've had a great time talking with them. And that's one of the nice things that's been part of staying here in Savannah, where you've made me a very comfortable and welcome guest. I was delighted to be asked to give the Sophia Lectures because there are a number of topics that I think are relevant to your theme this year that I've written about. And your theme was the whole. And I chose as a title, Wholeness, Imagination and Cosmos. So just a limited scope. And I thought that what I'd do is take 3 different angles of that over 3 different lectures. And the first one was on division and union, which is a very important theme in the coming into being of everything and according to Goethe, the way in which nature works, dividing the united and uniting the divided. The second lecture was on symmetry and asymmetry, because I think this is a profound principle in life, inside the human being and its brain, but also in the cosmos. And so it was a well worth topic from my point of view to explore if we were thinking about wholeness, because it's not as simple as people think it is. And it also takes us both from in here right out to the cosmos at large. And my third lecture was on finitude and infinity. That was indeed a difficult topic to approach, but I tied it in with wholeness and the imagination. And I think the three topics together would, I hope, for the listener, the viewer, present a coherent overview of a way of thinking about the world that to some extent we've lost.
Iain, we've called this series of lectures the Sophia Lectures. Of course, Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. And I'd like to ask you, what is wisdom?
I'm tempted to say that anybody who answers that is not a wise person. And it's certainly not something that can be operationalized. There isn't a path that will lead you to wisdom. Like many things such as happiness, it's a side effect of a life well lived. And I think it's something you can't claim to, in fact, you can't claim to it at all without exploding the concept that you could be wise. But I think particularly it's something that involves experience. It involves the coming together of a kind of learning, an explicit knowledge, with a vast amount of implicit knowledge that can come only from, as I say, experience. And wisdom can be amongst very simple people. You don't have to be a scholar to be wise. In fact, many scholars are not wise. So I find it I'm delighted to be associated with something called the Wisdom Lectures, but I immediately think, well, how does one live up to that title?
The Sophia Lectures were, at least in part, inspired by the Gifford Lectures established in the 19th century to take place at four of the ancient Scottish universities. They've had a very impressive and distinguished history over that century and a half. And though we're just getting started with these, one of the highest endeavors of the Sophia Lectures is to situate our contemporary culture within the longer history of Western civilization, but of you might say, of human beings asking perennial questions throughout all of recorded history. Why is it important to think about the present in relation to the past?
Well, it's profoundly important. We can't understand, well, I would say we can't understand anything without understanding its context, what surrounds it, where it comes from, and where it's tending. And we live in a world which has atomized, fragmented everything that it looks at in an attempt to find out what it is from the pieces. But this is, in a way, although a perfectly reasonable exercise, it's tending in the wrong direction, because to understand where we are, we need to see the whole. Coming back to this year's topic. And so people who don't understand the history from which they come and don't understand the culture that has formed them can't be fulfilled as members of that culture, of that society, and know how to further its ends and give back to it. Because we come from a culture that forms us, and the hope is that we will in some way be able to give something back to that culture. And I suppose that what I have hoped, it's a high hope, is that through my work and through the Sophia Lectures, as part of that, I can give back to the culture that formed me something important. In some ways, this is a microcosm of other things, the way that we come out of nature and return to nature. And we come, I believe, out of a divine ground and return to that. So these three large, overarching, each bigger than the last, contexts, if you like, or holes in which we inhere, are essential for understanding who we are right now. You don't find who you are right now by breaking things off and isolating yourself from history or from others, but by seeing more deeply into what it is that you inhabit.
We live in an age of kind of obsession and insistence on activity, on the flurry of doing this and doing that. And yet thinking requires stepping back. And so in a sense, we live in a time that massively devalues thinking, because what's the value in withdrawing to consider, to contemplate, to try and grapple with, let's say, the complexity of reality? What I want to ask you, Iain, in the midst of that overly active or hyperactive world, why does thinking matter? But more importantly, for those for whom this little conversation of ours is an introduction to the thinking you lead us on in the Sophia Lectures, what advice or observations can you share how to pay attention in a thoughtful way over the course of your beautiful lectures, how to develop the habits of being a rich and real and deep thinking person?
Well, as you know, the root of the word scholar is scholar, meaning leisure in Greek. And one needs unpressured time, not useless time, very useful time, but time that is useful in proportion that one is not forced to close it down into an activity, but to allow things to develop in their own time. Because we can't make certain things happen. We can make a mug, but we can't make great ideas, great works of art overnight. They come out of a good deal of time. But that time is not wasted. And we think that if we can somehow utilize it and show that it has been made useful, we have validated it. As a result, I think that far too many people are encouraged to close down their reflections prematurely to something that they can publish. And I know that if I had done this earlier in my career, when I did have quite a bit of freedom, I would not have been able to pursue the lines of thought that I have done, because I would have prematurely crystallized my thinking in too narrow a way. I think so leisure is important, and I think doing is, of course, part of life, but it is an ancient truth of the East that not knowing and not doing are also valuable. And that's not idleness and ignorance. They are, as I sometimes put it, an unknowing that comes after knowing, not the ignorance that comes before knowing, and an undoing that comes after doing, not the idleness that comes before doing. They are ways of refraining which have in themselves great wisdom. And one of the things I'm increasingly aware of, and the more I talk to people, the more I see it, is that we are frightened of things that limit. But limitation is actually the way in which most things come into being. A thing is defined literally by its boundaries. That's what it means. And much of what happens requires a certain restraint. It's not more creative to have no bearings, to have no compass, no rules or anything. Art, and indeed civilization, comes from a correct balance between restraint and action, between inheritance of wisdom from the past and the ability to innovate, but in the context of that wisdom. And so I think one comes back to the idea of wisdom. Philosophy, philosophia, the love of wisdom, is something that is not, I find, much pursued by many faculties of philosophy around the Western world, which are too concerned with a rather narrow conception of what wisdom might be. Indeed, most philosophers now repel the idea that they should be doing anything to do with wisdom. They're almost proud of the fact that they're doing something else, which is really a kind of anatomical dissection of life, at the end of which one's surprised to find that there's no life in it, and no values and no purpose and no end. So I think that wisdom requires this ability to hold in communion two tendencies that appear to the casual observer to be opposed to one another. And in our society, all that kind of thinking, which requires nuance, which requires seeing two sides of a question, that has been driven out by public discourse, which requires that we adhere to a certain narrative, which is the approved narrative, at pain of being silenced, and that we don't see that there are always more than one side to a question, many sides actually, and it's part of the purpose of education to let us see that. So all of this is leading to my view that what you are doing here is something wonderful, which is to provide a source of nourishment from the far past and from the near past and from the present together to make sense of life. And I see the young people who are engaged with it flourishing because of that in a way that far too few young people now can.
One of the characteristics of our age in this insistence on, let's say, activity is a kind of demand that everything be instrumentalized. And it seems to me paradoxically that when you instrumentalize something in advance, there's a sense in which you've closed off the horizon of its much greater possibilities.
Absolutely.
And looking back through the history of scientific discovery and so on, it's often non-instrumental thinking that proves to be the most productive. I wonder if you could comment on that paradox, and perhaps, if not to lead you through to presume what you might say, but something of the urgency of that kind of non-instrumental thinking in our time.
Yes, I think there's a huge problem for the humanities, which are the key to human education. The clue is in the name. And they're increasingly being driven out by more instrumental types of, I wouldn't even say education, but instruction. Instruction in methods, instruction in facts, which are thought to be useful for certain kinds of jobs. The trouble is that we are rapidly leading to a situation in which not enough people are really given a rounded education. And it's easy to dismantle a culture. It's easy to destroy education. It's very hard to make them evolve again and grow again. And so we must be very careful not to do that. And in this culture of utility, in which utility is worshipped above all other values, the humanities have tried to instrumentalize themselves and say, well, it's interesting to learn about Persian culture because, after all, there are various aspects of modern politics that involve Iran. But this is not the reason for understanding the depth, the length, the history, the philosophy of one of the world's great peoples. And this needing to show a use in terms of a monetary return is a mistake. I mean, not only because there's more to life than capitalism has in its purview, but also because in the past, these kinds of education did lead to people earning well, because it was conceived that if they were well-rounded in their education and they had actually come to grips with some really quite stringent and in some ways demanding kinds of texts in other languages, Latin and Greek from the past and so on, if they were able to do that and turn their minds intelligently to it, they could probably turn their minds to anything. If you limit it down to just whatever it is that is immediately useful, you've got people with technique, but you haven't got a culture. Now that's a really, really important distinction. One of the many problems with utility, Lessing said in the 18th century, the question, useful for what? And the answer comes back, useful for being useful. It's just good to have more and more stuff with which we can do things. But unless we have wisdom, how we use it could be very damaging. For example, technology is not necessarily either good or bad in itself, but it depends on a degree of wisdom in the users, because if it is used unwisely, and I fear at the moment it is in the hands of people who are very far from wise, then it can be destructive. It's like putting machine guns in the hands of toddlers. So it's extraordinarily important for survival, for all of us to be able to relearn a set of values that go well beyond those of utility. And those obviously include such values as beauty, goodness, and truth, and I would say also the sacred, which go back thousands of years and are universal values, in fact. So what I admire Ralston above all for is not having fallen in with the destructive mode of discourse that is now the popular discourse about education, and is standing up for those, I believe, eternal values. In a world in which people are increasingly isolated and express feelings of loneliness, it's one of the really striking features about modernity, that it certainly hasn't made people happier. We have hard psychological evidence that people are a good deal unhappier than they were even 20 years ago, never mind earlier in the 20th century when they were poorer. But one important aspect of this is isolation. And what a beautiful thing it is to see the young people that I've met at Ralston creating relationships and friendships that I think will last them through their lives. I see them everywhere, and they welcome me into conversations about things that are really important. And I'm delighted to see it. I think their understanding is sophisticated and also very generous in spirit. So they're kind. I see kindness among them, to me and to one another. And interestingly, that's something I remember very much from my own education, particularly at my school, Winchester, was that I made great friends there that have lasted me all my life. And the atmosphere was one of friendship and tolerance. And I expected that to be the norm in society, which it turns out not to be the case.
It's a point very worth reflecting on, and one that we've given really a lot of thought to at Ralston College for a number of reasons. So in some, at least serious and deep way, if only for the period that the students are with us, we hope to give them the context to develop the kinds of friendships that for them may become a pattern or give some insight into how to go about building, rebuilding communities, families, and the whole range of human relations that are necessary to their lives and to all of our lives. We often say that the college is devoted to 4 fundamental values: to the pursuit of truth, to the freedom that is necessary to pursue the truth, freedom of inquiry, freedom of thought, freedom of association, and so on, to the apprehension of beauty in all of its forms, and finally to the fellowship or friendship that is at once the condition for seeking those things together. Yes. We need others to help us seek the truth, but also the result of seeking those things together. We become friends with those we pursue these high things together. And then finally, I would say that there are many things wonderfully through the, as it were, the invisible hand of the marketplace that one can do through mere alignment of interest. But I do not think you can bring institutions like a college into being through a mere alignment of interest. I think only a shared vision rooted in profound relations one to the other that are themselves oriented towards the hard and necessary and beautiful work that our time demands is such an undertaking, even conceivable, let alone possible. And Iain, I want to thank you for being one of the friends that has enabled us to bring this college into being.
Well, you spoke beautifully and eloquently about friendship there, and it is something that you, above all, have brought back into academia. It's interesting, isn't it, reflecting on fellowship, because, of course, the fellows of colleges used to be literally fellows. They lived together, they shared their lives and so forth, and there was a good balance between communal living and having your private cell. But now what we have in universities is a lot of people brought together from all over the world and stuck into a little cubicle room that has a bed and a desk, and that's where they live. And of course they can join societies and so on. But there isn't, I can't imagine there can be the sort of thing that you have created in Ralston, where there are open living spaces. Everybody, of course, has their room, and I think rather nice rooms, actually. But nonetheless, there are communal meals which all share together at table, and communal spaces in which people get together and sing, recite poems, talk to one another, kindly include me. And I found this a beautiful expression of friendship. And I think it's a very important part in the process, and another thing that we are in danger of losing.
Well, you've spoken so beautifully in your lectures and written so wonderfully in The Matter with Things about the fundamentally relational character of reality and indeed to human life above all. Iain, it's been a great joy to have you here in Savannah, for you to share of the hard-won wisdom that you have through your many years of reading and thinking. As we were saying the other day, the questions have driven you deeper into life and life deeper into the questions. And I'm as grateful to you for sharing what you have with us as I know our listeners online and around the world will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's been a joy being here.